Welcome to Mill 2020 and this Corona digitized version of the real thing you might have come to expect in Lisbon in March earlier this year. Today in Copenhagen sort of felt like I was in Lisbon. It's a holiday here. It was like 26 degrees, no clouds. We were outside by the pool. In my case, it's a kiddie pool, but nonetheless, a pretty great experience. So I'm Josh Greenberg, or JG if you desire. And following about 14 years working on international music strategy at Red Bull, and then both in LA and Salzburg, and then 3 years doing the same as a global director at Spotify, I now run a creative strategy consultancy called Green Mountain Lodge, working at the intersection of music and technology, brand, and culture. And I'm based in Copenhagen, Denmark. So I'm super honored to be hosting my second conversation of this digital series with Mill. Thank you guys so much for having me. I'm happy to share the Zoom floor with these lovely people you see here. First, I have Vincent, or Robin, in French, in my best effort. He's worked in support of the creative industries since finishing impressive degrees in business law and European law and international development and partnerships. He's currently an A&R in the Orchard system and a producer host of the show Jetlag on OKLM Radio in Paris. Before this, he spent 3 years at Deezer between the editorial and content teams, and another 4 prior at 1D Labs overseeing the content org. So super great to have you, Robin. Thanks so much. Second, we have Terry Tyldesley. She's been colliding culture and technology as a delicate balance between art and commerce since the mid-90s. A longtime musician with a passion for content and experiences. She's spent a long run as a producer-director at the BBC, or the Beeb, for our Brits tuning in, moving these skills into producing many films and docs, a music tech conference in Berlin, groundbreaking VR concepts, standing up iconic art installations across the UK. Today, she spends a lot of her time running the music and tech site Kitmonsters, as well as serving as a board member for and former chair of the streaming co-op Resonate. And finally, we have András Bodrogi, has spent his career working at the forefront of new media platform development, a former TV, radio presenter, and lifelong artist-musician. He began working in the label ecosystem in about the early 2000s at both a major and an indie level. He supported music export offices, then branched out to build many of his own structures around distribution and the emergence of YouTube as a powerhouse. And today, András is actually Hungary's most decorated YouTube expert, hired by Google as their official trainer for the region, and helps musicians across Europe with their content strategies at State 51. Did I do a good job? So I'm going to give a little setup for this before we kind of jump into the conversation. So the global music industry is now worth over 50 billion US dollars with 2 major income streams. The first, live, makes up over 50% of the revenues and is derived mainly from the sales of tickets and live performances. Although it makes up 50% of the total, the average artist generates about 75% or higher of their earnings from live. And we all know the situation we're in right now related to the pandemic and that point. The second, recorded music, combines revenue from streaming, digital downloads, physical sales, sync revenues, licensing, for movies, games, TV, etc. And recorded music today is close to its pre-piracy peak for the first time in a long time, a testament to the growth adoption of streaming services by both labels and consumers. So streaming now makes up over half of recorded music's entire revenue. Pretty substantial. So just to give some quick stats on this, in the 2019 IFPI report, which was just released 4 weeks ago, May 4th of this year, global revenue growth is at an 8.2% growth year over year. That's the 5th consecutive year of growth following the 2014 bottom, our overall number of 20.2 billion US dollars. And streaming's share of revenue is actually 56.1%. So we're now eclipsed the 50% mark in the total revenue of recorded music. And of that streaming revenue, 42% is coming from the subscription revenue space, and about 14.1% is coming from ad-supported revenue in the free tier. Now, we've seen about a 24.1% growth in paid streaming revenues this year, 341 million paying subscribers, pretty substantial, but still some space. We've seen 22% in overall streaming revenues if we include the free tiers together, and paid streaming subscriptions have increased by 1/3 year over year. Now, interestingly, in context, physical sales have still declined 5.3%. And that's even with the surges in vinyl and cassette culture. But note, this doesn't necessarily take into account the secondary market sales and what's happening. Just a quick kind of note on the top 10 earners. No surprise, it's dominated by the Taylors, Drakes, Ed, Ariana, Posty, Gaga. But it's nice to see BTS and Billie Eilish in that conversation now as disruptors, alongside legendary catalog from Queen, and the Beatles are always there, right? Sync and performance have remained relatively flat year on year, but we're only 3 billion short. Seems like a small number in comparison, probably quite big. 3 billion short of the industry's all-time high in 2001, and the highest number that we've seen since 2003. Majority of this is being credited to the exponential growth of streaming. So that's a really interesting context for us to have a conversation today. So looking at what's happening here, what would you guys say are the main drivers of this growth? Where is it coming from? Which channels are carrying the lion's share, etc.? Robin, let's start with you.
Thank you for this great introduction with all the context and numbers and stuff. So it's really interesting. I think for this question, I will be based on my experience at Deezer. So I was, as you said, working at the editorial level, so making the playlist and thinking with the labels, also in the artist and marketing team, to think the strategy and stuff like this. And to answer your question on where, so basically it's all about your question where the subscribers are coming from, right?
It's where is the overall growth in streaming coming from?
The overall growth from the point of view we had at Deezer was really from the subscriber and the young subscriber. So the way the new audience are consuming music, basically, and the fact that now they are consuming music through their platform, and it depends, but so you have a lot of young people consuming through free, of course, subscription, but a lot of also with paid subscription, and the fact that they are mainly this new generation who are listening urban music. And it's really where the growth are coming from this point of view. So I would say that the main one are this between 15 and 25 years old, using the digital technology, of course, and the social networks, and who are half between paid and free subscriber.
Terry, what's your perspective on this one?
Well, when you said where are they coming from, I automatically thought of geography and geographical areas. And I think it's very interesting to see that the most recent increases in growth have been primarily in Latin America and also Asia, excluding Japan. And if you look at the map and at countries, say Spotify or Tidal, are active in, there's still a lot of blank map out there. So there's still a lot of potential for all the companies to increase further. However, local markets do have their own streaming services, and it's worth thinking about. In certain industries, in certain areas, there isn't a very strong existing music industry. And if you're going in from scratch, how are you going to do that? Hopefully with a more community-minded, collaborative perspective.
Absolutely. And obviously, we're talking about a lot of this paid space, but András, I'm sure, has a pretty unique perspective with the world's quote-unquote largest streaming service. But interested from your perspective, where do you see some of the growth in this space coming from?
I also would go for these geographical issues and the reasons, like YouTube just launched in new markets. And Latin America, probably in India, where the growth is just based by cheaper mobile phones and mobile devices. So there can be lots of reasons. I also believe that more and more artists aware how to profile themselves on the platforms, and therefore they are connecting more with more content on the platforms. That could be also a kind of driver of such growth.
Sure. And I mean, kind of to Robin's point, do we feel like we're actually seeing a growth in total consumption, or are these mostly listeners that are just switching their existing behaviors from physical or from, previous services now much more into streaming? Terry, what's your thoughts on that?
It's hard to be specific because the pace of change in the whole music and digital era is just absolutely accelerating, and particularly amongst younger audiences, embracing TikTok and using Twitch more for music consumption rather than just sort of gaming videos is really almost overtaking what the analysts can provide.
Absolutely. So do we fear that there is a slowdown in streaming revenue or its rate of growth? Where else do we think the audiences are actually going to go to consume this content? Or do we actually think that there is just no more people, to sell music to? What's our overall thoughts? András, I'm interested to start with you on this one.
It again depends on markets. I'm working mainly on emerging markets that I see a total different kind of consumption models and behaviors, and total different focus on different services. Like this region is really, really YouTube focused and YouTube centered kind of music consumptions that really, really something is working around these countries. And back to your questions, what is that now some sort of slowdown in revenues? Yeah, because of the actual situation of COVID. But I haven't really seen something like a really radical decrease in our ad revenues that I'm working with YouTube and YouTube related content from India till the United States with labels. And I see many different aspects of different increases and decreases in the platform. So I can't really generalize this, and I can't really answer this question with just simple answers like those.
Sure. I mean, Robin, like what do you think when people kind of have been talking about this idea of a slowdown in growth?
Honestly, in the number of people who are going to subscribe on streaming, there are no slowdown, and it will keep on growing. It might be a bit slower in like a market with a high penetration already, like US or UK and Scandinavia. But for instance, in France, we still have a huge amount of people who are not on streaming. There are, of course, more and more different kind of subscription, like the family plans or duo plans, to also provide to users some kind of new way to be involved in streaming with their family or friends. And also, you still have a lot of people who are around like 14 and who might be able in a year to subscribe. So the more it's going to be, the more you'll have new people in streaming. And of course, you have all these more emerging markets in the streaming industry. Like, for instance, when Deezer launched in MENA, so in North Africa and Middle East, it was also the question of all the people who were more in the free way of consuming streaming, and so they want them to switch to a payment way to consume streaming. So I think we have a huge amount of people still to switch to this streaming revenue.
So as long as we keep breeding as a population, we'll keep filling the funnel with potential consumers.
It's my
a decent challenge. Terry, who do you think are some of the losers in the growth of the streaming industry?
Where to start? I think it's very, very difficult for artists at all levels. And when you've got, we all love ABBA. When you've got Bjorn Ulvaeus from ABBA, who's the new president of CSAC, complaining about streaming and artists not getting their dues from it. He's advocating user-centric payments, for example, which I know Deezer is doing some piloting of. You've got people at that level. And then also, I think a lot of the losers in this are the emerging artists, because particularly in the current context where we have COVID, but even before that, there was some very interesting research from the Featured Artists Coalition in the UK, and they looked at where emerging artists got their revenue from. And 90%, their chief revenue stream was from live, followed by merch, and then streaming and royalties way down the bottom of the pile.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting. It's come up in a couple conversations, but obviously much of the industry's been pretty critical about the free tier in streaming and sort of the general funnel. And it's kind of funny because oddly, not that critical of free radio, with lots of varied neighboring rights constructs, or in the US with no neighboring collections at all. However, there's proof case that obviously free is actually growing the audience and the conversion is working. Like, do we feel like the industry is still sort of looking down on this free tier while the paid tier is continuing to grow at exponential rates in comparison?
The majority of my activities is related to the ad revenue, so related to the free tier in that sense. Like YouTube is now launched the subscription service and hopefully and visibly grow in the subscription with their subscription model as well. I wouldn't say that a free tier is something that actually killing businesses. I think it's something it helps, and something is a revenue for artists and authors at least from digital sources. So I would say I'm a kind of pro free tier person in that sense. I don't see this as something like a danger. However, like again, back to this market where I work, and these markets are like Spotify or Deezer are not really strong selling ads, and that part of their business are not that developed. So the free tiers are not really generating that much of revenues than the subscriptions.
It's super interesting. I just saw a stat that said that 25% of advertisers during COVID have entirely stopped advertising, and 54% on top of that have reduced their spends. So, when we're looking to compensate, artists through advertising paid into those free tier channels, and then COVID comes along and takes away the advertising revenue, we have to figure out where the money's going to come from. Robin, I mean, you were talking about some of the emerging markets and some of that. Like, what's your thought on the necessity of the free tier kind of moving forward?
I think it's quite just a natural movement, actually, that will happen. And I don't think I really have like a super deep opinion on that topic, to be honest.
Sure. Terry, any thoughts from you?
In terms of the free tiers, I actually take issue with your point on radio play, because radio play is more prestigious and more curated. So, and don't forget, people get royalties for radio play as well, which may easily outstrip the income they get from streams.
In certain markets, it varies market to market, yes.
Most of the e-commerce processes and marketing methods are about something free in the first step. So it's, I think, in a way, like many consumers are just probably grown up with this, and there are a complete generation grown up with practically not even know anything about intellectual property and the right holders behind. So when there were at least probably almost a decade to be able to not to have everything free, but it's like to somehow create this kind of sense that music should be or could be or any sort of intellectual property could be or should be free, sadly.
There is obviously the big philosophical argument that the free tiers have devalued music and hugely damaged the ecosystem. So
sure. And I mean, it's an interesting thought, because obviously we're talking about the evolution of streaming from a piracy space, which devalued it everywhere, but that was consumer driven. And now we're talking about companies driving, sort of an intent to reevaluate, but obviously there's commercial interest, intersected within that space, and obviously that's tech development. So, I mean, we'll have some good space to get into it. So, I mean, obviously we have lots of different perspectives in different markets, but can we kind of break down in general, like how streaming royalties are actually calculated? I mean, Terry, you started talking about user-centric payments versus the, kind of pro rata system that we're in. But like, how do we actually get to some of these micro numbers that we're calculating per stream?
It's hugely complicated because of all the black box accounting where we don't have transparency in the system. And one of the key things about what we're doing at the Resonate Ethical Streaming Cooperative is everything is transparent and people know exactly how much they get paid per stream, and it's the same for everybody. I'm sure, András and Robin can go more into the details of the accounting, but I think transparency is sorely lacking. And what we do know, and it's the analysts who are specialist analysts who are the ones who are able to calculate it with their inside market knowledge. But what we do know is that the rates vary hugely, and with Amazon and sort of Tidal up towards the top, and YouTube kind of in the middle, and Spotify kind of in the middle, and YouTube down towards the end if you're looking at a graph.
Robin, what's your thoughts sort of on the breakdown? Like, I mean, you come from the Deezer ecosystem, but like how are we actually calculating how this money is distributed?
As Terry said, it's like a really complicated way. So I'm not going to go into that route to explain that. But of course, it's basically depending on the number of subscribers, of the number of streams that the consumer on each platform are making. And through that, you have like a calculation. And you have also, as you were briefly talking about, András, the user-centric experience versus the actual way of calculating the streams, and the fact that today there are some artists through the system of remuneration that can have remuneration from a listen from another user that never listened to your music. So I'm not giving my opinion if it's good or not, but I'm just saying it's the way it is today, and people are thinking of new way of maybe doing this share of revenue. So Deezer, they begin to do a kind of lobbying in France around this user-centric, because it's something they want to experiment. But of course, it's complex because you have to do some deals with all the major and indie labels around that. So yeah, I think it's maybe more it's easier for the listener who are listening to us to go and really read some literature around that, because it's super complex, and I'm sure we'll be a bit lost to explain that by voice, because it's really about calculation, and it really depends on each platform and also on some specific deals with some labels. So yeah, just to say it's complex.
Absolutely. I mean, András, anything else kind of from your perspective on this? Or it's been said?
Probably YouTube is one of the most complicated ones within all of this. So it's like Spotify or Deezer pro rata based stuff. It's like, yeah, they have this monthly revenue, monthly revenues of also the subscription costs and advertisement revenues comes in, and then they collect it into one pool of money, and then they take their own percentage as the service, and paying the collecting societies, the authors, and everything. And then there is a content pool that practically they share with based on the artist's total listening numbers rather than the listening times of the individual users. And there is this dilemma as well. But in YouTube is for example, if you are a YouTube partner, your revenue shares differ related to if you are monetizing a partner-related music video or a user-generated content that's just using your audio excerpts. So it's like a kind of, I would say it would be another 2 hours long conversation just to go into really deep and to explain all of these different payment models.
It's more just to kind of address the complexity of this whole issue in this conversation, because there are so many different scenarios. But kind of on a broader level, obviously, everyone sort of has the interest in, I can't say everyone, but most people have the interest in making sure the artist is getting more, per stream, or, for whatever it might be. But if we see most of the streaming companies are, sharing 65% of their, total revenue inbound with rights holders in some capacity, and then they require finances to operate their business, and most of the streaming companies are still operating at a loss year over year. Like, is there more money to give? Like, or at what compromise do we increase the fees to the consumer or whatever it might be in order to pay the artists and then potentially shrink the amount of total subscribers? Any thoughts on that? Robin, you can start.
As you said, I really think from my point of view is that it's really a long road, because as we said, we still have a lot of consumers that are not using streaming. And as you say, it requires to have a streaming platform, a lot of work. You always need to develop some new algorithms, some new marketing aspects. So as you say, there's still a lot of loss on that. And I really think it's a long system where at the end, when you'll have less development, less marketing, because everybody will be using that, then you'll be able to think about like giving more revenue because you'll have more people. So I think it will take still like years and years to be able to find this ecosystem for artists. But as we said at the beginning, also artists are developing new creative way to get some revenues, even if streaming could be the super good way for them, but it depends of the type of music you do, your strategy, etc. So we'll talk about that later, I guess. But yeah, for me, it's a really long road, actually.
Sure. Terry, any thoughts on this one?
I think, we're all used to sort of VC-funded startups coming up, crashing, whatever. I think when you've got platforms like Spotify taking legal action to wriggle out of the increased royalties they should be paying by US law to writers, you've obviously got a problem. And I don't buy the argument that there isn't more wiggle room. A lot of the platforms have very unsustainable business models. The legend is Tim Cook said Apple isn't in it for the money, So maybe some of them don't deserve to survive if they can't give artists a better deal.
Would there be a world in which we as an industry or organization would just encourage consolidation and try and see things go into more singular platforms in order to see those audiences grow and then try and generate the most revenue in single locations? Or does it make more sense to diversify?
I'd like to come in on that. I think it'd be a terrible idea to consolidate further, because the one pattern we are seeing with the streaming is that in quite a lot of organizations, you're getting a real sort of blandification, because it's encouraging very casual listening. There's nothing wrong with casual listening, but particularly if you're comparing it with, smart speakers and people go play me some jazz, okay. But what happens to more niche, unusual music that isn't so profitable in the new streaming model? In Portugal, what happens to fado? What happens to all these amazing genres? And I think consolidation would be a terrible idea. I'm all for decentralization, which is something that we're working on at Resonate, and the more localized setups, the better.
Any thoughts on that, András, from your side?
It's visible, like all these services are struggling, with their profitability for many years now. It's Spotify is probably 15 years old at the moment. And there is a question why, and then there's content coming from the major side is still really expensive. They are giving it expensive, and then what Terry just mentioned, and then we are watching, or we are seeing platforms going into and expand their formats of content that they are distributing, going to podcasts, audiobooks, videos. Hopefully more and more these formats can be monetizable, and more artists will get closer to these platforms and have more control on their not just presence and branding, but probably a little bit even more. They can upload more different kind of contents and probably generate more revenue source for the services as well, besides audio streaming.
So, I mean, if we're talking like for an artist starting today, Robin, I'll start this one with you, obviously, because you have an A&R hat on the day-to-day too. So I have an artist starting today just distributing their first album. What percentage of their revenue, do they come to expect from streaming?
It really, as you guess, it really depends on each deal that you have, because it's you can't give a number, because every artist has a specific deal with his own producer, who has a deal with his own label distributors, so you can never say it's this percentage for the artist. What we can know is, as you said earlier, that there's a percentage that keep the streaming platform for making the mechanism working of the streaming platform, and then you give the other to the distributor. But then it's a question of deals. And so, as you say, as an A&R, it depends for each single artist. It's every time a different deal, different producer, etc. So yeah, but the thing which is great with the artists today is the fact that, as we said before, as András said, there are more and more innovative ways also to promote their music for the artists, because they know that streaming is the way people are consuming. So they are doing a lot of ways through the social network. They are maybe releasing more music also in order to be more present, in order they adapt also to the way people consume. And I guess it's also the history of music, that the artists adapt the way they create music through the way people is listening music. So like when we were doing music in churches and then to the bar, so the musicians adapt themselves in the way they created music because the listener was not in the same behavior to listening to that. So it's the same with streaming platforms. So I guess it's just like with technology, a natural way to create new thing and to find new innovative way to give your music to the people who want to listen to that. Or at least, as we say, with the smart speakers, there's also a positive way to see that through the moods playlist, because a lot of people are consuming music now through the moods playlist in the streaming platform. So moods playlist is chill music or music to work out or stuff like this. And it's also a way for the editorial behind the moods playlist to be innovative in the way you put smaller artists in that or independent label in this type of playlist, because people are less expecting something when they listen to a chill vibes playlist. They are not expecting something precise. So that's where you can put also more independent or more niche artists. And it's also a way for people to discover, or at least to give some streams to this type of music. So I think, yeah, we have a lot of kind of experience to make with that.
Sure. And Terry, I mean, you were talking about that research that was supported in the UK, that like 90% of revenues are coming from live, and then merch, and then sync, and other things, and then somewhere down the line we saw streaming. Like, where do you see kind of the general percentages for an artist starting out today?
It's interesting. I've been speaking to record companies about this, smaller independent record companies, and there just isn't a one-size-fits-all, as Robin says, because somebody signed to a smaller label. The label may not take any cut as an act of generosity towards the artist. Some labels may take 60%, and then you've got percentages to distributors. And it all depends on if the artist is, if it's a new album and a newer artist, on how big their existing fan base is. If you've got a big fan base already, they will jump on it. If you have to build it up, then you're not going to see much streaming revenue from your debut album. So it's very, very variable.
And I think that's an interesting thing, because you might have seen a slight fluctuation in percentages and label contracts, somewhere around 80-20. Maybe it's slightly less, slightly more for years. But the idea of changing percentages and changing structures is all relatively new, and it's been pressured by this ecosystem because the services that are being required to be presented are slightly different. András, from your side, like what do you see as sort of you're obviously looking through a YouTube space quite a bit more, but in general in the streaming space, what does this look like for somebody, starting out today?
Yeah, it's based on the food chain that the previous panelists just kind of detailed, like how many actors between you and actually the actual streaming platform. Is there a label? Is there a distributor? And then what sort of deal you have with those? And I'm just always coming this question to me, that have artists ever been paid well after there's some recordings? You just mentioned this 80-20, or can we just tell that they've been anytime?
It's an interesting point, because there was always sort of a business agreement associated with the recorded side that was that you're going to go out and tour and you're going to keep your live revenues. And we're going to use that as an exchange so that we can recoup our investment in you and, go from there. And then 360 deals started coming into play about 15 years ago. We started seeing that come to life. And now it's like, is there, if live is gone, is the current structure, if you are signed, 97% of total, revenues coming across are coming through the three majors and, the independent distribution sector. Is there, like, if that type of ecosystem continues to sustain, like, is it on the tech platforms to solve it, or actually do some of the label ecosystems need to reset their structures to accommodate better distributions as well?
Yeah, yes, of course. But back to this, like, let's say the shares of an indie artist, like an emerging indie artist with their first album, they probably will generate around, again, 50-60% coming from digital, that's for sure. A huge chunk will be YouTube instead of Spotify, I would say, if you are an indie artist right now, because it really depends how big is your fan base right now. And previously, YouTube gave way more options to connect you with your fans on their platform that Spotify did. And they just started their Spotify for Artist platforms and features and solutions for artists to reach better and reach strategically fans on their platforms. So I would say here probably this revenues coming from streaming side is really YouTube driven.
Now we have a whole slew of independent distribution options where the artist can go direct on some platforms. That, I mean, obviously YouTube, they can load their own content to the platform. That's fine. But there's some platforms that are allowing you to distribute direct to platform. Some of them, obviously, you have distributors that are taking an annual fee instead of any percentage, and you keep 100%. There's sort of merger platforms like United Masters or Amuse or Q&A, the new one out of LA, that are giving 100% of revenue to distribute your stuff, but then coming back to you with a label deal if it starts to work. Like, would you say there should be a greater mobility of artists moving into independent distribution moving forward in order to sort of stabilize the economy a bit further? Terry, we can start with you on this.
It's very interesting, this whole sort of gamut of distributors from cheapest chips, DistroKid upwards. I think anything that gives artists more flexibility is good, but there is a fundamental problem of artists not getting their fair share. It's all right for your Adeles and your bigger artists. And what's very noticeable is that, for example, in the UK, some of the leading grime artists like Jamie and Wiley are keeping their music off streaming platforms or only putting it on much later because they want to sell physical copies. And also there's a huge new campaign which has been getting a lot of extra traction with the COVID-19 pandemic to fix streaming, and that's been set up by the Songwriting Academy, the Ivors, and by the Musicians Union. So there is a great re-examination at the moment of values, and I think that's not just in streaming, that's not just in music. I think that's in every aspect of our economic and personal lives at the moment, and I think that is where there may be a lot of changes to be seen.
I mean, Robin, you work at one of the alternatives right now, right? You're still part of the general major label food chain. You're in the Sony system, but the Orchard does offer an alternative. Like, talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and as you said, I think what is great in 2020 is the fact there are so many different options for the artists compared to like 30 years ago. And us at the Orchard, the idea is like to give this boost to the artist and to work with them on their marketing strategy, on their innovation, on the pitch to the platform, on the artistic aspect if they want to. And the fact that more and more now in 2020, artists are becoming in a way more independent than before, because through the social network, they are more able to connect with some video makers or other people. So they are like sometimes in crew, and they not necessarily need all the work from a label from like before. And the fact that they want also to be the owner of their music, that you can still be when you only work with a distributor, even if, for instance, the Orchard can be really involved in the development of the artist in different way. But the artist is still the owner of this production. And we can see that there are more and more artists that are keen to be in this way of working, being at the same time independent, but on the other hand, to be working with professionals of the industry. And so it's the dynamic that I felt when I was at Deezer that I feel today. So it's interesting because, as you say, you can have this option of being like just an artist in your room and being able, if you want, to push your music tomorrow on streaming platform, and you can, on the totally opposite, be still a total what we call artistic contract in France. I don't know the term in English, but be 100% support by a label, and you have more and more options coming every day. So that's great.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. The point sort of stands out to me. Like every artist walks in the door wanting to own their masters today, obviously, and it's like if you ask them why, there's like a stutter step at some point as to that question. But András, obviously, you work with a lot of artists on like a consulting strategy, and different businesses on how they're distributing their music and strategically marketing. Like, what are your thoughts on sort of going independent and utilizing, services like yourself or other professionals to kind of help build your ecosystem?
Regarding streaming, and if you would choose a DIY distributor instead of going to a little bit, like bigger ones, they have probably more direct and personal contact. I really do believe that you as an artist need some sort of help and some sort of human interaction from a distributor in long term, if you think in long term, or if you think really, really seriously that you want to reach as much as you can related to one single platform. Right after you, as you're an independent artist, has just spend a lot of time to understand how each platform works and what sort of techniques and methods you can do to optimally manage your rights there or optimally maximize your revenues on each of these platforms. So it's a massive amount of new expertise you have to pick up as an artist and myself as an artist, just using songwriting to balancing my mind, not go for a huge career as well. But all those who are wanting to have a career, they mainly focusing on going to a label deals after a while, or if they're doing DIY and doing independently, they have to have the knowledge, they have to have the expertise, they have to have some sort of team of experts, and that's why I just found a lot of space as a consultant and an expert to help a massive amount of labels and artists just to explain how they can optimally monetize their content and how they can create what sort of content, how they can think about content creation, how the consumption of content works on that platform, what sort of changes happen between the traditional way of creating content related to our sound recordings and these days what's really happening by creators on a daily basis in myriads of different formats. So it's a massive knowledge and expertise and it's really, really intimidating. And this is happening for all of us all around the world. So I wouldn't even say there are any more, there are developed market, like, for example, those grime artists, they can't do that in UK because in UK they have space to sell probably a physical with more chance than in an emerging market like ours. So artists have to be everywhere and they have to know kind of everything, how they can grow and how they can develop on all of these platforms. So DIY is a massive challenge. It's a beautiful way, it's a massive challenge. But previously, we had even in the traditional recording, in the traditional world of the sound recordings, there are great examples, like, I don't know, the Eichstutz and the Naibaiten, or many bands who are, or Marillion, or something like from the prog rock genre-specific, collecting their audience from all around the world. They have a couple of hundreds, thousands of fans they know and they meet and they rely on with their business.
If we're looking to enact a different change structure to this, like, who has the biggest negotiating power at the table to make any of these changes? I mean, obviously Apple announced they'd renewed long-term deals, with all three majors. Spotify got their deals locked up with Sony, Merlin, and then during COVID, they just announced the Warner deal got sorted. We're still awaiting UMG for that one. Tencent's in a good spot, but they might get some pushback because there's obviously a little rumor of TikTok's sort of streaming platform development in parallel. And obviously there's a lot of, to your point, András, there's a lot of formats that are being developed around the platforms, so we see new songs that are being conditioned for that type of art. YouTube's been pretty constant on their deals, overall, but like who has the biggest negotiating power at the table to change any of this? If we want to see change. Robin, what's your thoughts?
To be honest, I don't have on this question, so I will let my two other at the table to speak.
Sure. Terry, what's your thought?
Artists and fans. I think whilst record companies have the potential to change the deals and the proportions and the percentages, artists are the ones with the power at the end of the day, and they can encourage their fans to do something, whether that's follow them somewhere, take up some different platform, do stuff on Bandcamp. And I think it's very interesting that dialogue through digital has become much more close, much more enabled. And, artists can take their fans somewhere else if they want to. Not in all cases. I mean, Spotify is not brilliant at sharing data with artists, and it's one of the things that's very important for a platform is to enable artists to have access to the fan data. But we know some of the biggest artists like Taylor Swift and Pink Floyd have had issues with platforms, had music on or off. And at a much smaller level, there's a band called the Royalties who signed to Heavenly Recordings in the UK, and they were talking about the tip jar on Spotify. I hope we'll be coming to that at some point. And their fans were begging them, no, let's do something on Bandcamp. So I think artists have that power, and I think increasingly they are organising, and collaboration between artists is potentially a huge powerful thing.
And András, I mean, you were talking about obviously the food chain and all those people that kind of get broke off in the middle. Do they have an interest in seeing this change? Is there genuinely, besides the artists, do they have partners in trying to see, a change in this economy to lean more towards into fair, quote unquote, fair distributions to artists?
Oh, it's a really complex and difficult question. I do believe in the power of artists as Terry does. And however, what we've seen right now, I mean, the biggest power comes from the collecting societies, author and composition related right holders and their agencies. And they could probably reach the furthest point so far. How this would change with time or could be changed, it's a massive amount of interest of the majors in it, so it's pretty difficult. And I would say even worse to separate the sound recordings right holders and the composition related stuff and lobby, because it's time to time it's kind of goes against each other. Time to time, I mean, for example, if they now really enable anyone to use any kind of third-party content in their videos, you wouldn't be able to monetize it. All the content ID systems would be kind of, okay, why do we have right now just to block in everything everywhere? I know it's a total new ways and complex ways of monetizing our intellectual property as artists, but this is what we have right now, and I think everyone should understand how this works before telling that they're not paying enough or they keeping the rest of the money. And mentioning this supply chain or the food chain, how many actors between you as an artist and the platform that is selling your music. It's back to Terry, you as an artist, you have the power and you have many possibilities to narrow down and to do this. And what we've seen in the couple of last years, I mean, all of these platforms are somehow, I wouldn't say this, it would be probably a conspiracy theory that they try to eliminate labels and label-related activities, but all these Spotify for artists, YouTube for artists, Deezer for artists, and everything, and even some of them give more power and more access to your own things and catalogs and everything within the platform, and then they took it away and then give it back, and then Spotify gives you gave you a possibility to upload anything and then sell the music directly. It failed, so they also somehow practically experimenting with such things that narrowing down this and let's give the artist more this way to somehow, I don't know, take away from the other actors.
So with kind of our last few minutes here, I didn't want to marinate it in it the whole time, but let's talk Corona for a little bit. Obviously, the COVID crisis has validated streaming, for a lot of people as a need in consumers' minds, and it's accelerating already present trend over the past couple of years. And a shift to this type of consumption. So what have we seen, happen during the Corona crisis in the streaming world that you guys sort of, what are the pluses and minuses, I guess, during this period of time? Things that you've seen that are good, things that you've seen that are a bit challenging. Obviously, people are making changes pretty rapidly from an artist side, from a label side, from a live streaming, from a platform, etc. Robin, what have you seen during the crisis that sort of put as negatives?
Going to try to be consistent and short, but of course we've seen like a decrease at the beginning, but also way people were consuming music, which was different, but also in a way not different, because the way they listen music was really a way they listen music before during the weekend. So during the weekend, people are less listening music than during the week, and it was a bit like this at the beginning of the crisis. Having said that, a positive now solution that the platform have put forward is also the localization of music. And it's also something we are, as The Orchard, working, is the fact that we are more and more supporting the local heroes, because it's also what is since few years trending in the way people consume their music. They want to find it's more related to urban music and local music. So there's also in France actually a huge support from the platform about the local music, from the radio, from every business, because it's like, okay, let's go closer to our artists, to our heroes in a way, in the creative way. And the fact that also we have more and more music traveling, and we have more and more like K-pop or reggaeton who can be bringing to another country, and it's accelerating that. Also the fact that you can still discover music through your home, and I think it's also a kind of musical future through that way. So I would say it's positive for this localization and travelization, I would say, of the music. So it's one of the topic.
Sure. András, from your side.
Myself as a person practically preaching about the music-related digital and online content and how to produce those, and then for multi-platform activation. The last 2 months was actually the golden era of digital-related music content for me. And it was great to see so many creative ideas with limited resources to do some really nice things. Live streaming, of course, a boom, and such softwares that we are using here right now. And the question how to monetize those, it's raised as a question, and probably put a challenge to services and some sort of, I don't know, I hope a competition for the artists that they would be able to monetize this content even more. I mean, live streaming as well. And Robin, yes, practically coming here to each market, understand the market, The local heroes and the local content is crucial for growing in such markets, I do believe as well.
Before we get to Terry's point on this, as a follow-up to kind of both of you guys, like, do we feel like, obviously this is a requirement out of Corona, and we like, generating revenues from the country to feed into our local heroes and whatever it might be. But if some of our artists in some of these markets have ambitions to truly be internationally known, do we see some of that like local prioritization becoming a barrier to some other markets considering importing, international talent?
I'm sure they can balancing the algorithm such ways that enables those artists to somehow sneak out to bigger and other markets as well.
Sure.
This extra localization will be for few months, and maybe you can put a break in your internationalization career for few months, and then you'll come back on that. So we have to keep in mind that it's for a super short period of time. It's extra localization, but it's still a movement of localization for music.
Yeah, absolutely. Terry, from your side, what are sort of the wins and losses of the of streaming during the Corona crisis?
It's been a very rocky road, we know, which is that streaming's been dropping because people aren't making their usual gym visits and their travel to work, with a little lift from people working at home who may be streaming more. But I think what's absolutely clear is that there are a bunch of very devastated artists, not including my cat, who have seen their income totally dry up. And the argument that streaming's good for you and that it's a shop window and you can make money in other ways now just absolutely doesn't wash. And in terms of live streaming shows, that's very variable. People aren't used to paying money. The fact that there is a tip jar on Spotify is being seen by many as an admission of failure, that it doesn't work for so many artists. And I firmly believe it's vital that artists should own the technology they use. I think it's very interesting. A lot of the talk today has been about giving artists, as you know, people give artists and they're supposed to be grateful. And I think now's the time for artists to organise, to be more involved. And the process, that we're having at Resonate, which is it's a streaming platform that's co-owned by artists and listeners, and people get shares in the profits, is a great model going ahead, along with things like the Creative Passport that Mycelia and Imogen Heap are putting together to give artists their metadata and all their work in one place.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's there's so many learning. I appreciate that you kind of brought up the point. We kind of talked about the devaluation of sort of what this looks like, and in particular during the Corona crisis, all of the live stream offerings that were automatically made available to everybody because there was this peer pressure, sort of fear of missing out, that everybody was participating and jumping in. And instead, in some cases, we might have trained the audiences that this is free again, instead of sort of holding off and saying, let's analyze a bit of this. And obviously, we appreciate some of the things like Erykah Badu went and built her own platform and, monetized it pretty early because she couldn't find the paywall that she liked and she couldn't find the platform, to serve the needs, to connect with the audience. So, I mean, we are seeing the ability to get out there and build your own technology. If there's not a solution out there, is now something that's accessible to every artist. So to your point, like, absolutely, artists can take control of that narrative themselves.
And it's very exciting. I mean, at the weekend, there was a great festival in Minecraft. There's all sorts of stuff that people are trying out at the moment. So there's certainly a lot of opportunities there to do things differently. Yeah.
And, honestly, like, I hate to call it this, but out of desperation comes magic. Like in some cases, you require this type of pressure to go, the system isn't fully set up. So we're seeing a lot of people trying a lot of things, and some of these companies aren't going to last much past 6 months, but they got something through during this period of time, and then other people are going to see something sustained. I mean, if we really look at like the IFPI report come May of next year, are we from the recorded revenue side of music, are we going to see a significant decrease? What's the thought?
I think there's going to be massive change, and it's going to be very difficult for a lot of different music companies, because we're going to be heading into great economic troubles, no matter what country you live in and what government you're under. And it's very, very hard to predict what's going to happen, but we may find that companies are getting the plug pulled because the VC investors just aren't going to pump any more in to keep them afloat. I think we will have a very, very different landscape next year.
Sure. András, from your side?
I'm working in the digital field, and my revenue is coming from digital sources. In the last 2 months, I haven't seen such radical drop or decrease on revenues. But yes, of course, it will be probably a big decreasement of revenues related to this couple of months. Hopefully, this won't return for us again this year.
Robin, you have the magic ball. Like, what do you see inside it?
As we said in the beginning of the conversation, I think it will increase in all the digital aspects. But of course, as we have the live aspect, which is super big in artist career, it will depend country by country how the live is coming back. But of course, because of this live miss for many months, at the end it might be a decrease. But for digital, I'm confident, and it's still increasing. But unfortunately for artists, it's because of live. So it's maybe there are some solutions. For instance, in France, there are the SACEM, so for the rights of the artists, who say that they are going to generate revenues when you have a live from YouTube, for instance, depending on the number of views, etc. So maybe the digital live could be a way to generate your revenue in different countries. But of course, it will be small, but at least it's a new way to create some revenues. So.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, we could probably talk about this for 3 hours, but we can't. They won't let us. So I feel like it was a really good snapshot. We kind of danced around a lot of different parts of this conversation. Really appreciate you guys' different perspectives from different parts of the world as well in it. Thank you so much for joining. Super nice to chat with you. Look forward to connecting in real life, in human construct, in a future state. But thank you guys for joining, and thank you to the Mill team for having us. And we'll look forward to more.